Hi, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, where we explore the environmental topics that green up our world. Today's guest is Julie Craves, Supervisor of Avian Research at the Rouge River Bird Observatory of the University of Michigan Dearborn. She'll help us answer the question, what does my choice of coffee from the rainforest have to do with the survival of some of Michigan's cherished birds? Julie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So let's just get straight into it. Why does our morning cup of coffee have anything to do with rainforest birds?
Well, the majority of the birds that nest in eastern North America aren't here year-round. They nest here in North America and they winter in the tropics. Okay. And so those birds need forested habitats or intact habitats for the most part to be able to make it through the winter, where really they spend most of their year. And traditionally, coffee is grown as an understory tree in semi-forested or forested areas. And within the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a real push to technify coffee growing in the same way you see big agriculture in North America. So we've gone from coffee raised in the understory of forests or among, say, fruit and citrus trees that farmers use for themselves or timber, to these great monocultures of coffee grown in the sun. And therefore it's destroying habitat for the birds that winter in Central and South America and then fly to North America to breed.
So the birds that are in Michigan raising babies, a lot of them came all the way from these coffee plantations areas?
Some of the, yeah, you know, not every species of migratory bird necessarily is a forest bird or goes to those particular areas. But coffee is originally from Africa and is now grown all over the world, anywhere somewhere near the equator, so in tropical areas. And so for our North American birds, the majority of which do go to the tropics for winter, many of them do use those coffee farms, especially those now that still will grow coffee under shade.
That's one thing that surprised me when I read some. I guess you've written quite a few articles, you do blogs, and there's a website you've got, coffeehabitat.com.
Right, so that's my website, Coffee and Conservation, because when I first became interested in this, I thought that there was some place where I could go to learn about what kind of coffee should I buy. I used to be a tea drinker. And I did some number of trips to Cuba through the Treasury Department. It was licensed trips doing bird survey work. And I was a tea drinker, and the tea there is pretty bad. There, it's a coffee growing nation, so that was when I started drinking coffee. And it was only about 2004, 2005. And so when I came home and decided I liked coffee, I was going to start drinking coffee, I needed to find some resources. And I really didn't find one-stop shopping for all the information I wanted, so I thought, well, you know, there must be other people like me who are interested in birds and feel like they should be doing the right thing. I'll throw together a website. And that's how Coffee and Conservation was born, and it's now been, you know, hundreds of posts and a lot of background information. So I've been writing that since around late 2005.
Well, it's really helpful. I really appreciate you getting that information out there, because this is something that so many of us do, is drink a lot of coffee. I mean, many cups a day, some of us, and so it's kind of amazing to think that we're having such an effect through such a simple thing.
Exactly. You know, for something that's so ubiquitous in our lives, I encounter people that don't really even make the connection that coffee grows on trees. You know, so.
Yeah, I guess I always thought it was more of a shrub.
It's a small tree, and generally they do try to cultivate smaller varieties or prune them so that, because they have to be hand-picked. They tend to grow the coffee, the species of coffee that most people drink is a mountain grown that grows at higher elevations, and so it's on steep slopes, and it has to be hand-picked because it doesn't ripen all at the same time. And so you have to make several passes through the plantation to get all the bends. So anyway, if it's too tall, I've actually been in Panama and seen handmade ladders on rocky slopes propped against trees, and people picking the coffee, and it's you know, bad enough as it is without without adding added danger. So it's you know, generally you'll see most coffee farms have coffee trees that are probably, you know, 6 feet tall or roughly.
And the fact that they're understory, meaning there's other trees above, means it's a complex ecosystem. So there's a lot of different types of well, all different types of insects, and the ecosystem is very full and varied, so then there's more birds that can use it.
And other biodiversity, you know, so coffee isn't necessarily grown, you know, rustically in a forest. That's quite rare these days, but even small farmers, which the majority of coffee is still grown by people who grow on less than 10 acres of land, They will intersperse their coffee with bananas and plantains, citrus, timber crops, mangoes, so other fruits and crops that the families also use, and then the coffee is the understory of that.
Yeah, so this is something new to me. When I read your website, I was surprised to learn that coffee started out being a small farm, diverse type of thing, and this more monoculture, sun-grown is a newer development.
Yeah, it's still grown very frequently by small farmers, but they've been encouraged to now try to do something that's higher yield. So, I mean, in the same way that small farms in North America have gone towards, a variety of crops and then a crop of monoculture of corn, say, you want a higher yield, something that's easier to pick. You can just kind of go down the rows and pick it. The problem with these new varieties that were developed and pushed on small farms, on small farmers, or on larger plantations, is that when coffee is grown in the sun, it's under a lot of stress, so they do have these tolerant varieties, but they require more fertilizer. Like in any monoculture, you don't have as many predators and a little bit out of balance, so you're using more pesticides. Coffee is a very high nitrogen requiring crop, so you're using a lot of fertilizer. And so there's a lot of inputs into this, and it burns the coffee. I mean, within 4 or 5 crops, then the coffee kind of burns itself out, and they have to be torn out and replanted. Whereas you could grow coffee have many old trees, provided you prune them and keep them going if you were growing under shade. Some of these older heirloom varieties. So
if a label says organic, does that mean it's probably shade grown?
It's easier to grow coffee organically under shade, but it's not necessarily a given. Then there's nothing in the organic standard that requires growing under shade. So that's not a component of the actual certification.
Speaking of certifications, there's a lot of different labels for coffee. Can you tell us some of the ones that you think are important to think about or watch for?
So the most rigorous ecological standard is called Smithsonian Bird Friendly. And Bird Friendly is actually trademarked by the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. It was ecologists that were studying the decline of these migratory birds and discovering kind of the connection with coffee and our migratory birds that developed these standards. It's a very, very small part of the market, so it's not really easy to find. It's also required to be organic certified. And part of their standards actually has to do with the percentage of canopy trees and how many species are involved, and a lot of these things that make up this nice diverse habitat that helps these birds survive, and other biodiversity as well. So that's a great thing to look for. Smithsonian has a little seal and you have to look for that seal because some people will say, oh, this is bird-friendly coffee,
but I know you can order it online.
You can. There's a company in Canada and a company in the U.S., so it's birdsandbeans.ca is in Canada and birdsandbeans.com here in the U.S. They sell exclusively Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee. It's also available, the same Birds and Beans coffee at Ypsilanti Co-op.
Oh, really?
Wild Birds on Maine and Ann Arbor. So on the birdsandbeans.com website, you can look up all the merchants that sell it in different states.
Oh, that's great.
Right. And there's a couple brands, a couple of varieties now offered at Whole Foods that are also bird-friendly. They're starting to kind of push in that direction, too.
Well, that's great because people want their coffee fresh. I know that some of these online services will send them to you every month, but then you have to pay shipping and all that.
It's still cheaper than everybody's new favorite with the little disposable, we won't even say what the word, but that's very expensive, and convenience comes at a high cost to the environment.
So if it's rainforest certified, is there such a thing?
Yeah, there's a Rainforest Alliance is another organization, and they certify not just coffee but a lot of other agricultural and non-agricultural products, and their ecological standards are not quite as strict as bird friendly because they also address a lot of other topics, including workers' conditions,
fair trade.
A lot of other different things. So it's not quite as strict, but there are some farms that wouldn't qualify for bird-friendly certification either because they don't farm organically or that they're farming in an area that's not forested, for example, so they can't meet the canopy requirements.
Oh, yeah, on your website you were talking about the cloud cover.
Right, so there's two main places where it would be very difficult to get bird-friendly certification. That would be at very high elevations where great coffee is grown. Generally, the higher it's grown, the slower the beans develop, and it's very flavorful. And those areas are kind of, they're full of clouds. It's cloud forest, and so you have very misty clouds there till, late in the morning or midday, if in those conditions they were also growing under a lot of canopy that would be required, they would be really susceptible to a lot of fungal diseases, just because it's, there's not enough air circulation. So that's one instance. Another instance would be in, for instance, in parts of Brazil where they grow coffee, they don't grow it in forests. There's high elevation savanna, which is originally like grassland areas. And so there's some Rainforest Alliance certified coffee farms there where they focus on different kinds of habitat preservation because there is not forest there originally.
And another point I got out of your articles and your blog and everything is that if you buy coffee that's from small farms, you're more apt to get the bird-friendly type of thing, even if it's not certified?
Well, when you buy, I like to know, there's a small coffee company, I think it's in New York, that says don't buy coffee from strangers. You want to know where you're, in the same kind of local food movement, of course we don't grow coffee locally here, but you kind of want to know where your coffee comes from. And if you know your coffee roaster, a small coffee roaster, and that has close relationships with individual farms and these single origin coffees, you're much more likely to, these small roasters and really want to have a sustainable supply of coffee themselves. It's in their best interest as well as the farmers, and everybody works together to make sure that they have good coffee in the future, and that part of that is being a good steward of the land.
Tell us about some of the birds that we see in Michigan that come from these coffee farms.
There's a number of species that are maybe familiar, at least to birders, that are kind of in trouble, that really do spend a lot of time on coffee farms. One is the wood thrush. That's still a common bird and familiar, but undergoing a lot of declines. Breeds
that
over.
one has such a beautiful
and a great
song.
Yes, one of the best songs
We're
ever.
going to play that song too,
right,
and
great.
we're going to show a picture of it.
Okay,
It's
great.
really wonderful.
And wood thrushes generally from this part of the country winter in, say, Honduras and Nicaragua, so in Central America and those areas. And I've been to a farm in Nicaragua that has a lot of wintering wood thrushes, and the owners of this farm actually grow coffee strictly for Allegro Coffee Roasters, which is Whole Foods' wholly owned subsidiary.
Oh, okay.
And they basically run their coffee farm to support their bird conservation work. So they do a lot of work with wood thrushes and color banding individuals to see how they're moving through the farm and what types of habitats they're using.
Is that the one that allows people to come and stay?
You can stay there. It's called El Jaguar. It's in Jinotega, Nicaragua. It's just a fantastic place, and the owners are terrific, and they've done incredible bird conservation work. Another species would be golden wing warbler, which is a bird that's also declining. And I have also done some work down in Nicaragua on a different farm with North Carolina Audubon is very involved in some golden wing warbler work both in the breeding grounds and down there, so that's another species.
When we were at McGee Marsh, everybody wanted to see a golden wing warbler.
It's
I guess they come there sometimes.
Yeah, and they do pass through this area, but they are becoming, I hate to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but I used to see them more often than I do now.
That's what happens.
Cerulean warbler is another bird that's a candidate for threatened or endangered species listing in the United States that goes all the way to the Andes, and they will also utilize these shade coffee farms.
Wow.
As habitats being destroyed for various reasons in the tropics, these shade coffee farms, they're not, nobody's pretending that they're as great as, undisturbed forest, but they're connecting forest, habitats, and they do provide what's needed for a lot of these birds to make it through the winter in a healthy state.
Well, you made the point in some of your literature that in some areas where livestock is being grazed and forests are being cut down for development, that these small coffee farms are actually better than not having them at all.
Right.
They're
and
refuges almost.
One of my one thing we all need to realize is we can't expect coffee farmers in the third world to make the effort, for instance, to grow coffee organically. It's a huge, that you have to have all your own organic compost and fertilizer, for basically hand weeding and taking care of pest control by using IPM. And these are not people, many are not even literate. and they don't have, an extension service or a university nearby. There are some countries that have very strong coffee boards that help, do extension, but a lot of this very remote. So it's a huge effort for them and an expense for them. This is how they, try to get their kids through school and put a roof over their heads. And we're not willing to pay 15 cents more for a pound of coffee or a cup of coffee. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And if we want other people to help preserve our world for us, we need to make it worthwhile for them. Because if they can't get the extra money, they're just going to sell it on the open market, and it's going to end up in the grocery store at Folgers, and they're going to not make any money. And eventually they're either going to quit farming coffee and they're going to have a pasture, or abandon their land, or turn to growing illegal drugs. Some of them, that's a lot of coffee is grown in those areas, and it's a real struggle for those people. So,
and
soapbox, sorry.
Well, that's important stuff to think about, because we spend a lot of money on coffee, and a little bit extra is,
and it's still extremely inexpensive. When you think about a per cup cost. Every year I add up how much I've spent on coffee, and I generally buy most of my coffee online because I try a lot of different coffees, or roasters send me coffees, and I like to know what's out there. And I keep track, so I'm paying shipping on most of the coffee, and my husband and I, plus the coffee we give away or use for coffee tastings, probably go through 60 to 65 pounds a year. And we're still paying far less than $2 a cup. I put a spreadsheet on my website, so every year you can see my year in beans and how much I spend. And when you think about that small expense compared to many of the other things that we spend money on, Americans are very used to really cheap coffee. And I like to say there is no such thing as cheap coffee. It's expensive for all of us to drink inexpensive coffee.
Yeah, good point. I've given bird-friendly coffee as Christmas gifts, and it comes in beautiful packages, and it spreads the word. And
exactly, yeah.
So how can people avoid the coffee that's grown in the sun?
Well, kind of right with the theme. If you're paying not very much for coffee, the big red thing of Folgers in your grocery store that's, 32 ounces for $7.15, can almost guarantee, first of all, that they probably don't even know where their coffee is coming from, because they buy in bulk from middlemen all over the world. And it's cheap coffee, so it's not something that's being grown it's kind of like this difference between a canned tomato and an heirloom locally grown tomato. It's an agricultural product, and it's seasonal, and you get what you pay for. So that's one of the things, to just avoid those big grocery store brands. They control 50 to 60% of the coffee market in the world, and the biggest providers of market share in North America and the United States, for instance, is Smucker's, which owns Folgers, Dunkin' Donuts grocery store coffee. Those are their big lines, and a number of other smaller lines. And they have virtually no certified coffee, and have no sustainability reporting, and one of the worst track records in that regard of any of the big coffee companies. So try to go a little bit smaller, get to know your roaster, your local roaster, and explore. I have a lot of recommended purveyors on the website.
Okay. And can people let their coffee companies know why they're not buying what they're, if they've made a decision not to buy it?
I'm not sure it would make a huge impact with like Nestle and some of those big ones, but the thing to do is to encourage your smaller people that are trying it out. And Allegro Whole Foods is a great example. They're trying this. What they have right now that's bird friendly is this early bird blend, and they're roasting a little bit darker than they typically roast, because that seems to be what the market demands. I prefer a lighter roasted coffee myself, but they're testing the waters, and if you want to have them, continue to use that, I would encourage anybody who goes there to say, hey, I'm buying this because it's certified bird friendly. I mean, absolutely. Tell the barista there or the store manager, and let that trickle back, or their website. Their coffee buyer is very responsive to that kind of thing, and they will listen. That's why they're trying it out.
Great. Okay, good advice. Well, we've got a couple more minutes. I'd like to now ask you about the Rouge River Bird Observatory. Tell us about that.
So that is the donor-funded program of the Environmental Interpretive Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. That's where I got my undergraduate degree, and part of my senior internship was to learn bird banding. I'd been a bird watcher for many years, And I found it so fascinating that I knew that my advisor at the time had a bird banding permit. So I went away to Massachusetts and took this 6-week field course and came back and wanted to do a little bit of bird banding on campus. He hadn't done it since the 1970s, I guess.
You don't think of downtown Dearborn as a big place for birds.
No, and the reason why it was sort of intrigued me and I wanted to do it was that they have a 300-acre natural area. This used to be Henry Ford's property.
Oh, that's beautiful
Yeah.
there.
And very urbanized. Nobody at the time, this was 20-some years ago, was doing any sort of work about the importance of urban areas to birds.
Okay.
So everybody who was an ornithologist wanted to be up at, in the UP of Michigan or some, coastal areas and sort of pristine. Everybody wants to go someplace exotic to do their bird work.
I bet Henry Ford would be pleased because
Henry Ford loved birds, exactly. So there was a little historical tie in there.
Mm-hmm.
And as it turned out, I think that the Dearborn bird checklist is now 258 species, I want to say.
Great.
So most on campus.
That's
And
a
so
lot.
that area was really being used by migratory birds in particular as a stopover. So when they're coming and going from North America to the tropics, they're stopping there in spring and fall.
Is it because of the river, the water source?
That's part of it, but just it's this island of green in this
Okay.
enormous urban area.
Yep.
And why I thought that was important was because these migratory birds, they make this journey, back and forth twice a year. They migrate at night for the most part, small songbirds. So they need a place to stop and rest and refuel every day in order to continue on their migratory journey. And in this increasingly urbanized world, of course, this is what they're encountering, these little green spaces in these urban areas. And so nobody was really looking at the importance, what kind of resources they were using. And so that was something that really interested me. And when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. So yeah, 22 years of working in that.
So by extension, do you encourage people to make their yards bird-friendly habitats? Because
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I lived in Dearborn up until a year ago. We had a tiny little postage stamp yard we were on a corner with 7 neighbors. We had a little pond and we put in, trees and shrubs and all kinds of native stuff. And our bird list when we left there, I think, was 135 species, something
Wow.
like that, in
That's
this little
great.
tiny yard. So it's definitely possible, and every little bit helps. Those are the little tiny stepping stones that help them make their way.
And what would you say are some of the main things people should do in their yards for birds?
I always think, shelter and water and food. Those are the 3 necessities for them. We had a very small recirculating pond. I mean, when it's small, like not much bigger than this table. And so it was a great water source. And birds would always be stopping there, and they could hear it because it had the
Yeah,
water.
I've heard
going.
they like the sound.
Yeah, that's what attracted them.
But let me just say, I'm not going to be able to put a pond in, but apparently if you just have a little, pan that you keep
even a bird
fresh
bath that
water.
you have a dripper in, or
Oh yeah, dripper.
yeah,
Yep.
that'll work. We planted a lot of native fruiting species so
Okay.
that they had fruit in the fall, anything with a real small berry.
Serviceberry.
Serviceberry is more of a summer, but yeah, it goes into the fall.
Oh.
In the fall, a lot of the shrub dogwoods,
Oh, okay.
pokeweed, which is
That's that's beautiful.
we have a ton of, even at our new house too, and birds
I
love
didn't know
it.
birds like that.
They
Oh.
love it, yeah. Anything bigger than that's a little bit difficult for most small songbirds, but many of these birds that eat exclusively insects during the breeding season switch over to fruit in the fall because it's an energy source. It's very abundant.
Oh, wild grape too, right?
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. Yeah, and
Because a lot of people think wild grape's a weed and they get rid of it, but apparently it's
poison ivy has a little white
Oh,
fruit
really?
on it.
Well, that I'll get rid
persists into winter. The birds really like.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, fruit for the fall. Anything with seeds. So any kind of any of the sunflowers, not commercial sunflowers, the kind that they grow in big fields, but some of the smaller native varieties that have a lot of seeds for goldfinches and other sparrows and stuff will use all those seedy little plants like that. And
Would you recommend leaving those up over the winter
Yes.
so that they can?
because you need structure, right? You want to have places for them to hide, especially during migration. This is an unfamiliar area. They do need to sleep during the day when they're not foraging, so you want to have some protected areas and where they can mess around.
A lot
in
of
it.
people like to get rid of
I
everything
know.
in their garden, and then it's
So much easier. Just wait till spring.
Yeah, it's true, and it's pretty to see the weeds.
Sure,
in the winter.
snow on it. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what's the website for the Rouge River Bird Observatory?
Easy stuff. rrbo.org.
Great.
And all the stuff about our research is on there.
Okay, wonderful. Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks.
For an online archive of today's show, go to ewashina.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.